Now, after slavery, we know that the vast majority of Negroes could not read, but some of them did, in fact, have a strong interest in learning how to do so, and it didn't matter if they were young or very old, because when the reading fever spread amongst this group of blacks, it caused them to place a high importance on education, as we'll see as we continue reading from the Booker T. Washington collection, which contains his autobiography, Up from Slavery, right? So let's pay attention and observe and see what he has to say. Unity. From the time that I can remember having any thoughts about anything, I recall that I had an intense longing to learn to read. He described it as an intense longing to read. As soon as he could think his first thoughts, reading was on his mind, which suggests to me that this was perhaps naturally or genetically influenced to a large degree. Some people just have an affinity for this activity at a very young age, while others may develop it over time and later in life. But Mr. Washington had an intense desire from a youth, and we'll see how that intense desire manifested in him as we continue reading. I determined when quite a small child that if I accomplished nothing else in life, I would in some way get enough education to enable me to read common books and newspapers. Soon after we got settled in some manner in our new cabin in West Virginia, I induced my mother to get hold of a book for me. He didn't ask for toys and clothes. He asked his mother to spend her limited resources on a book for him. How or where she got it, I do not know, but in some way she procured an old copy of Webster's Blueback Spelling Book, which contained the alphabet, followed by such meaningless words as ab, ba, ka, da. I began at once to devour this book, and I think that it was the first one I ever had in my hands. I had learned from somebody that the way to begin to read was to learn the alphabet, so I tried in all the ways I could think of to learn it, all of course without a teacher, for I could find no one to teach me. At that time there was not a single member of my race anywhere near us who could read, and I was too timid to approach any of the white people. So what did he do? Just give up? No. Remember, he had an intense desire to learn to read. Desire is fuel for humans, which propels them towards certain objectives. And if a person has a real strong desire, they use their limited mental and physical resources to find ways to satisfy that desire. So, with no literate Negroes around and being too timid to approach whites, how did he learn to read? In some way, within a few weeks, I mastered the greater portion of the alphabet. He doesn't even know how he figured it out. He just knows that after some weeks of trying, he mastered a good portion of the alphabet, which are obviously the building blocks used to put words together. In all my efforts to learn to read, my mother shared fully my ambition and sympathized with me and aided me in every way that she could. Though she was totally ignorant, she had high ambitions for her children and a large fund of good, hard common sense, which seemed to enable her to meet and master every situation. If I have done anything in life worth attention, I feel sure that I inherited the disposition from my mother. So we see that his mother played a vital role in supporting him. She was ignorant in the reading department, but she was ambitious for him to learn, and so she encouraged him to do so. In the midst of my struggles and longing for an education, a young colored boy who had learned to read in the state of Ohio came to Malden. As soon as the colored people found out that he could read, a newspaper was secured, and at the close of nearly every day's work, this young man would be surrounded by a group of men and women who were anxious to hear him read the news contained in the papers. How I used to envy this man! He seemed to me to be the one young man in all the world who ought to be satisfied with his attainments. You see how valuable the skill of reading was to this group? Today, most people take it for granted in the U.S. because most people can read. But at this time in the late 1800s, it was scarce in the Negro community. So it was appreciated when someone did possess the skill. About this time, the question of having some kind of a school opened for the colored children in the village began to be discussed by members of the race, as it would be the first school for Negro children that had ever been opened in that part of Virginia. It was, of course, to be a great event, and the discussion excited the wildest interest. The most perplexing question was where to find a teacher. The young man from Ohio who had learned to read the papers was considered, but his age was against him. In the midst of the discussion about a teacher, another young colored man from Ohio, who had been a soldier, in some way found his way into town. It was soon learned that he possessed considerable education, and he was engaged by the colored people to teach their first school. As yet no free schools had been started for colored people in that section. Hence each family agreed to pay a certain amount per month, with the understanding that the teacher was to board round, that is, spend a day with each family. They had no public free schools available, and they didn't wait around for the government to build one. What they did was take their limited, hard-earned money and spent it on making one for the community. Now remember, since resources are limited, people choose to spend it on what matters most to them, whether that's on cars, clothes, alcohol, books, schools, or anything else. And the more limited the resources are, the more strategic and intentional people should be in determining where those resources flow. Now, for this group, they were intentional about their currency flowing towards education. This was not bad for the teacher, for each family tried to provide the very best on the day the teacher was to be its guest. I recall that I looked forward with an anxious appetite to the teacher's day at our little cabin. This experience of a whole race beginning to go to school for the first time presents one of the most interesting studies that has ever occurred in connection with the development of any race. Few people who were not right in the midst of the scenes can form any exact idea of the intense desire which the people of my race showed for an education. They had what? An intense desire. That means that this desire was stronger than most of the other competing desires within them. Because everyone has a multiplicity of desires within them at any given time. But time is limited, and so are resources. So the desires that are strongest are what people act upon in their lives. And for this group of Negroes, education was one of their strongest desires. As I have stated, it was a whole race trying to go to school. When he says the whole race, he means all those identified as Negroes who lived in this small country area in West Virginia. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn. As fast as any kind of teachers could be secured, not only were day schools filled, but night schools as well. The great ambition of the older people was to try to learn to read the Bible before they died. They wanted to know what the good word actually said. But the obstacle in the way was reading. So guess what? Strong ambition can easily move that obstacle out of the way so they can reach the end goal. With this end in view, men and women who were 50 or 75 years old would often be found in the night school. You see that? Whatever was required to be done to learn how to read the words for themselves. It didn't matter how old they were or if they had to attend school at night. That burning desire had them showing up to acquire the skill. Some day schools were formed soon after freedom, but the principal book studied in the Sunday school was the spelling book. Day school, night school, Sunday school were always crowded, and often many had to be turned away for want of room. The opening of the school in the Kanawha Valley, however, brought to me one of the keenest disappointments that I ever experienced. I had been working in a salt furnace for several months, and my stepfather had discovered that I had a financial value, and so, when the school opened, he decided that he could not spare me from my work. Here we go. The first obstacle he encountered on his journey towards education. Now it's time to see how bad he really wanted it and what he was willing to do to get it. This decision seemed to cloud my every ambition. The disappointment was made all the more severe by reason of the fact that my place of work was where I could see the happy children passing to and from school, mornings and afternoons. Despite this disappointment, however, I determined that I would learn something anyway. When a person is highly determined, that means they have a strong force of energy propelling them. and they are highly likely to do what they are determined to do. And this goes for any human, because all humans have these powers. So although Mr. Washington faced the setback, he was still determined to find a way to still learn. And this is what he did. I applied myself with greater earnestness than ever to the mastering of what was in the Blueback Speller. That's the book he mentioned earlier that he used to master a great portion of the alphabet. My mother sympathized with me in my disappointment and sought to comfort me in all the ways she could and to help me find a way to learn. After a while, I succeeded in making arrangements with the teacher to give me some lessons at night, after the day's work was done. So he couldn't make it in the day due to work, but he could use some of his limited available time at night to study, which is what he did. These night lessons were so welcome that I think I learned more at night than the other children did during the day. My own experiences in the night school gave me faith in the night school idea, with which, in after years, I had to do both at Hampton and Tuskegee. But my boyish heart was still set upon going to the day school, and I let no opportunity slip to push my case. Finally, I won, and was permitted to go to the school in the day for a few months with the understanding that I was to rise early in the morning and work in the furnace till 9 o'clock, and return immediately after school closed in the afternoon for at least 2 more hours of work. The schoolhouse was some distance from the furnace, and as I had to work till 9 o'clock and the school opened at 9, I found myself in a difficulty. Work ended at 9, but school started at the same time. So he was jammed up. Is he going to give up now? No, because he's running off the energetic fuel of intense desire, which seeks vigorously to find expression in the physical world. So this is what happened. School would always be begun before I reached it, and sometimes my class had recited. To get around this difficulty, I yielded to a temptation for which most people, I suppose, will condemn me. But since it is a fact, I might as well state it. I have great faith in the power and influence of facts. It is seldom that anything is permanently gained by holding back a fact. There was a large clock in a little office in the furnace. Here it comes. This clock, of course, all the 100 or more workmen depended upon to regulate their hours of beginning and ending the day's work. I got the idea that the way for me to reach school on time was to move the clock hands from 8:30 up to the 9 o'clock mark. He asked himself the question of how he can get out of the jimmy he was in. Or more precisely, his conscious self planted the seed question into the fertile grounds of his unconscious mind, which then sprouted the idea back to the conscious mind to move the clock hands 30 minutes ahead so he could leave work earlier and make it to school on time. You see? Now, this may not have been the most ethical move, which he understood, but this is what he felt needed to be done to satisfy his intense desire. This I found myself doing morning after morning till the furnace boss discovered that something was wrong and locked the clock in a case. I did not mean to inconvenience anybody. I simply meant to reach that schoolhouse in time. My second difficulty was with regard to my name, or rather a name. From the time when I could remember anything, I had been called simply Booker. Before going to school, it had never occurred to me that it was needful or appropriate to have an additional name. When I heard the school roll called, I noticed that all of the children had at least 2 names, and some of them indulged in what seemed to me the extravagance of having 3. I was in deep perplexity, because I knew that the teacher would demand of me at least 2 names, and I had only 1. By the time the occasion came for the enrolling of my name, an idea occurred to me which I thought would make me equal to the situation, and so when the teacher asked me what my full name was, I calmly told him Booker Washington, as if I had been called by that name all my life. Hot stuff! And by that name I have since been known. Later in my life, I found that my mother had given me the name of Booker Taliaferro soon after I was born, but in some way that part of my name seemed to disappear and for a long while was forgotten. But as soon as I found out about it, I revived it and made my full name Booker Taliaferro Washington. I think there are not many men in our country who have had the privilege of naming themselves in the way that I have. Talk to the people. The time that I was permitted to attend school during the day was short, and my attendance was irregular. It was not long before I had to stop attending day school altogether and devote all of my time again to work. I resorted to the night school again. In fact, the greater part of the education I secured in my boyhood was gathered through the night school after my day's work was done. I had difficulty often in securing a satisfactory teacher. Sometimes, after I had secured someone to teach me at night, I would find, much to my disappointment, that the teacher knew but little more than I did. Often I would have to walk several miles at night in order to recite my night school lessons. There was never a time in my youth, no matter how dark and discouraging the days might be, when one resolve did not continually remain with me, and that was a determination to secure an education at any cost. Throughout all the dark and discouraging times, he still never gave up, right? Since a youth, he made education his life's mission, and he was tested all the way through, just like everyone else is tested throughout their journey in life. But what makes the difference is how people respond. And as we continue with Mr. Washington's story, we will see that he continued to respond in some very inspirational ways, because he was tested a lot. He was tested a lot, especially before he was able to build the Tuskegee Institute, right? And we'll see some more of those tests in the next commentary. So what we'll do is we'll stop right here. And so I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.